Okay, so this is the second lecture. It's working with foresters. We're just going to talk about, I subtitle it "Who's Who and What's What." This is probably the second most common question I get, and that I have gotten over the duration of my career. The first is, why is my tree not healthy? And the second one is, how do I find a forester? And so the question of how do you find a forester starts with understanding what a forester is. And foresters are different than loggers. I have some webinars on, and I posted resources on the Teachable site, so you can help. You can do some additional self-learning. There's a webinar that's essentially this presentation. So you can watch it there, or you can watch it here, which is being recorded. Sometimes landowners aren't aware. I mean, you all have been, thinking about what's happening in your woodlot, and so it's an easier sell for you to think about why you would want somebody that's specifically trained in forest. Other people don't know why they need to even think about or worry about a forester. And foresters are trained very broadly. They have courses in soils, they have coursework in wildlife, they have coursework in hydrology and water, they have coursework in tree biology, in timber harvesting practices, in silviculture, and they have this broad, just educationally, they have a broad base of knowledge from which they can deal with the notion of managing, manipulating, and utilizing things within I'll say a woody plant environment. So they can provide technical assistance. So you can ask them a question, and on a technical level, they should be able to respond to it. Woodland owners want to know how to do the right thing, and so the forester, with the guidance that you provide in the form of your ownership objectives, the forester can tell you what it's going to take to accomplish that objective. But also note that the selection of a forester potentially influences the success you have with your objectives. Like all professions, there are good foresters and there are bad foresters. What I want to talk about today are the different types of foresters, thinking about how to select a forester, the services that a forester provides, the types of payments, payment methods, just a little nuancing on contract clauses, and then I'll offer up the take-home messages through all of this is that you need to be prepared, so you go into this conversation deliberately, and you need to stay in control. So in the difference, maybe to put this into a context, the difference between hiring a forester and hiring some other kind of a professional, the other professionals that you hire typically have a pretty good idea of what you want to accomplish. When you go to a doctor and you say, my arm is broken, the doctor knows without you saying that you want your arm to be fixed. Or if you go to the dentist and you have a toothache, it's pretty clear what the outcome is. When you go, and it isn't necessarily that straightforward with all professionals. Your CPA knows that you want to reduce your tax burden, but there may be some other things you want from your CPA. You may want to do some long-term planning for financial, maybe consistency of debt load or something like that. Your forester, when you talk with your forester, you and your neighbor might have two very different outcomes. Your neighbor may just want to make all the money they can as quickly as possible, and you may want to make money, but you also want to maybe sustain the woodlands for its ability to support maple syrup or mushrooms or silvopasture or whatever else. So by staying in control and being prepared, you need to be able to explain to the forester, here's what I want. This is what I'm going to look at to measure your success as a professional. So how do you know a forester when you see one? In some states, there's a legal definition. There is not a legal definition in New York. So in New York, anybody can say they're a forester. And I've known people who are not foresters. They'll have a business card, and they'll say on the business card, it just says forestry services, which is different than saying you're a forester. So there is not a legal definition. In states like New Hampshire, they have licensed foresters. Other states have licensed foresters or registered foresters, not in New York. The educational background, typically we'll think about what we call a professional forester has a 4-year degree and a technical forester has a 2-year degree. If somebody just says forester, it's presumed it's a 4-year Bachelor of Science degree. We're going to come back to the duration of education a little bit later. I've worked with some people that have a 2-year technical degree in forestry that are exceptional in what they do. And I've worked with some people that have a 4-year degree in forestry that are significantly less than exceptional. So the educational background, it'll eventually come down to more like experience. So we also know a forester by the experiences that they have and the services that they offer. Foresters, rural land foresters work in rural settings, such as you see pictured. You can also have urban foresters that work in urban settings. I think it's reasonable to expect your forester to belong to a professional society. They don't have to, even in states where they have licensing and registration of foresters, they're not required to belong to a professional society. The key professional society is the Society of American Foresters. It's a national body. There's also the Association of Consulting Foresters. So I belong to the Society of American Foresters. I cannot belong to the Association of Consulting Foresters because I don't practice consulting forestry. And then some foresters will also have some type of certification. And those certifications are by a organization. So the Society of American Foresters has certified foresters, which I am a certified forester. And there are third-party certifiers, such as this, who has them? I'm drawing a blank. It'll come to me. So within the group of types of foresters, there's one group that are called public, more generally public foresters or public service foresters. So the state agency has public service foresters, and those foresters provide a public service by working with private woodland owners. They're also sometimes called private lands foresters in New York because there are public lands foresters. So you would want a forester that's going to come to the private land. So you could call your state forestry agency and say, I own a woodlot and it is 10 acres or 100 acres and it's in such and such a county, and I'd like to schedule an appointment for the private lands forester to come out and talk to me about how to practice good forestry. So that's all it would take, and now you're on their radar. What is probably not going to work well for you is for you to call the state agency and say, hey, I want to have a timber sale. Can you send out a private lands forester? Because these foresters have, there'll be one forester that covers 2 counties or something like that, and they are really busy. And if somebody says, I want to have a timber sale, they're going to probably tell you to contact a private sector forester, which we're going to talk about in a minute, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but my guess is that most of you have a long-term planning horizon, and you want a starting point that's going to be provided by these public service foresters. Some counties and other state agencies will have foresters that do forestry work. In New York, there's 3 or 4 counties that have foresters that work for the County Soil and Water Conservation District that primarily work on county forest land, but will occasionally help out on private lands. And then there are academic institutions, land grant institutions, forestry schools that are paid by the public dollar, but they don't provide on-site services. So my salary comes from tax dollars, and so I'm a public forester, and I provide services, but it's not on-site technical services, it is educational services. Then there are associations and non-governmental organizations that will have foresters, landowner associations, land conservancies. Earlier I mentioned that New York Audubon has a forester on staff. The Nature Conservancy in New York has a forester on staff, and they do different things. I'm not familiar with what specifically they do, but there may be something that they can offer for assistance. In the Catskills, there's the Catskill Forestry Association. They have foresters on staff for their members. And then there are private sector foresters, and these are broken into two categories: consulting and industrial. So consulting foresters, by definition, work for you, the landowner. So you pay the forester, and that forester has a fiduciary responsibility to you. It's like when you hire a real estate agent, when you hire a lawyer, when you hire a plumber, they're working for you, and they have an obligation to serve your needs. The industrial forester works for a mill. So they work for a paper mill or they work for a sawmill. And they have an obligation to the person that's paying them. Their job is to interact with private landowners and supply the mill with wood. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not a good forester. And I know some industrial foresters that are extremely good foresters. But keep in mind that they're paid by the mill to serve the mill. And if you're going to work with them, do so in a way that you have a conversation that they're going to be providing you with the long-term sustainable management that you want. And then there's groups that are, so the loggers are not foresters. Loggers are absolutely important to the forestry process because trees don't get moved without loggers. But loggers are not working as foresters. Some of them are trained as foresters, and they said, I'd really rather just, be a logger, and that's fine. But they're not foresters. And the key thing is that foresters are making decisions about what should happen in the woods. Loggers make decisions about how it should happen. So the forester might say, what's going to happen is we're going to cut some of these trees, and we're going to install some roads, and we're going to put in a landing and whatever else. And then the logger would say, okay, here's how we can accomplish that. So they have to work in partnership. Timber brokers are people, some of them are trained as foresters, some of them work as loggers, but what they really do is they just buy and sell trees. So they'll show up on your property, they may mark some trees, they'll have you sign a contract, and they'll give you some money for it, but then they'll take that contract and they'll resell it to somebody else, and then you end up having not knowing what's going on. And the person that shows up that has a legal contract to work on your land is not the person that you signed the paperwork with. So timber brokers are somebody that you want to be really careful of, I'll say avoiding. I would encourage you to not have anything to do with timber brokers. And I have a website that talks about arranging a timber sale, and that talks about a timber sale contract. And one of the clauses, of course, that you would want in a timber sale contract is that it's not transferable. Okay, so what could your forester do? And you can see the list of things. And I say could rather than should, because what should your forester do depends upon the relationship that you have with your forester and what you're asking them to do. So minimally what they could do is inform you about your opportunities. So they could say, all right, you know, you said that as an owner you want to make money, and so I'm looking at your woods and you have an opportunity to make money by doing whatever. They would also should inform you about the feasibility of your objectives. You know, in Steve Childs, I think, gave the example of, Steve's not a forester, but a landowner said, well, I want to be a maple producer. And so they walked around for 2 hours and Steve only saw 5 maple trees. So the feasibility of being a maple producer with 5 maple trees changes a little bit. Now it means you're not going to produce your own sap. You might have to buy sap. You can still be a maple producer, but the way you're going to accomplish that. The other things that they could do are develop things like a management plan that we were just talking about. They could inventory your property, appraise the value, establish the basis. And the basis is a tax jargon, so that if you, what it means is that if you buy a piece of property and you've bought it recently, it's worth determining the basis, and that is the value of the trees relative to the value of the land. So if all the trees disappeared, what's the value of the land? And then the value of the trees is separate. So when you have a timber sale, you can deduct the basis from that sale, and you don't pay revenue tax, income tax on the basis portion of it. And there's a calculation that goes into that. They could develop and assess wildlife habitat, locations for recreational trails. They could develop a planting plan. They could develop a prescription, which is a marking guide that says these are the trees that should be cut and these are the trees that should be left. And then they could administer that timber sale. What they should also do, I say should, is they should admit if they have a bias. For example, there are some foresters that think you should never drill a hole in a maple tree, and other foresters that think you should never turn livestock into the woods. And that's fine if they want to believe that. We could talk about the legitimacy of their bias and my bias. And I'm quite comfortable with drilling holes in maple trees and putting cows into the woods if it's done correctly, but they should admit that bias. Similarly, they should admit limitations. And if you say, I really need to know about the tax side, the tax implications of a timber sale, they should say, wait, I just need to tell you, I don't know anything about taxes. So they admit that. And then if there's any conflicts of interest that they have, so they might tell you what would be a conflict of interest. So a conflict of interest might be that they're related to or maybe they used to work for the sawmill that commonly purchases timber in that area, or that their cousin is a logger, or I don't know what. But if there's any conflicts of interest, then they should be willing to disclose those. So what are the services that you can get? So this is what they should do. If you're working with a state agency, they should do a site visit. They should develop for you a stewardship plan. And this is, I say free, it's really prepaid. So your taxes have paid for them. So these are all prepaid. They should advise you on any federal cost share programs. There are not a lot. So it's always worth asking, but don't start with that as part of your business plan. And then give you advice on your goals, right? How are you doing? If you have a goal for firewood, or if you have a goal for maple syrup, they can advise you on that. Academic institutions in New York, the forestry academic institutions include Cornell University, which has a very small forestry component, but it's expanded through the county network of cooperative extension. We do education. At some of the county educators will do site visits, not very many, but they'll work with our trained volunteers to do site visits. The other academic institutions include the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry and Paul Smith's College. So these are the academic institutions in New York. Cornell and SUNY ESF do research. SUNY ESF and Paul Smith's do forester education, so they'll train foresters, and ESF and Cornell will do forester continuing education. So most of the academic institutions don't go on the ground and give technical assistance. Private sector foresters, remember, include both consultants and industrial foresters, and they provide, I say, from A to Z. They will do essentially anything and everything that that you want done. So some of them, and some foresters will do a lot of different things. So I was on a field training for foresters last week, and I was talking to some different foresters, and one of them does urban forestry, and he's a certified arborist, and he's a certified forester, and he'll write management plans, and he'll write reforestation plans, and he'll work with villages to do inventories of sick street trees, unhealthy street trees, and things like that. So some of them do a lot. Others, all they do are timber sales. So if all you want is a timber sale, then pick a forester that you know is good with timber sales. But if you want a forester, and most of you are probably, maybe it's not what's on this list, but you're going to want a forester that does a variety of different services. Think about what you want and then work with a forester. We'll talk about picking a forester, but having those experiences is important. And again, I'll just say, when you're thinking about consultants versus industrial foresters, the consulting forester works for you, the industrial forester works for the mill. Timber brokers, I've already tipped my hand in my bias in that I don't like, I like them as people. I don't like the job, the function that they serve, which is just to broker timber. All they're interested in doing is buying timber and then reselling it, or moving timber, and their whole objective is to maximize their profit margin. They're typically, but not always, self-employed. They may be mill-employed, and they're not really interested in your goals for sustainability. And you'll know them when you see them, because their lead is really about getting you to sell some of your trees. So if the lead is about, I'm happy to help you manage your woods, then that's one thing. But if they show up and they say, oh, looks like you've got some sick trees out there, and I'd be happy to cut them for you. Or I heard one story about, I've heard this has happened on multiple occasions, but somebody went into somebody else, a broker went into a woodlot owner's woodlot with paint, marked the trees that broker thought should be cut, tallied them up, went up to the landowner's door, knocked on the door, and said, hey, I just happened to be in the area. I was walking through. I saw that you had some trees that looked like they should be cut, so I marked them. Here's a list, and I've already made out a check for you for $5,000. Are you ready to sign the contract? So for me, that would make my hackles stand up. If somebody was out in my woods marking my trees with paint, I think they get an earful. So if that happens to you, do not accept whatever offer they've given you, because it's not going to be good. So how do you find a forester? So there's an article that I've put on the Teachable website. I think the title is Working with Foresters. It's chapter 10. Yeah, it says it at the bottom. It's chapter 10 from the Stewardship Bulletin that's on the class webpage. So the first thing you need to do is make a list of potential foresters. And that's what this page is all about. So how do you make a list of foresters? So you look at the state agency will have a list of cooperating foresters. You talk to the trained volunteers. They will know 2 or 3 foresters in the areas. You talk to other woodland owners, and you say, you go to the woodland owners, to the landowner associations. They have a chapter potluck, and you go and you talk to a few people and say, who's your forester? Talk to your neighbors. Go to the local farm bureau meeting and talk to the farmers and say, who's your forester? Look on association websites. Sometimes there'll be foresters that will have display boards at landowner workshops. So what you want to do is you want to get a list of however many you can, not 20, not 2, but 3 to 6 names of foresters that work in your area. That's the first step. The second step is thinking about how you evaluate their quality. And this is a list of criteria that I would use to hire a forester. So first, I think one of the things that's all of them should have some amount of education. Working with that assumption, what's next most important to me is that they participate in continuing education. All of the professions, whether it's a dentist or a lawyer or a CPA or a plumber, there's new things happening in those professions and they need to know what that is. If your forester's not actively learning about these new things, then they're not going to be able to best serve you. Most of the times, oftentimes that continuing education is provided by professional societies. So I would want to know what professional societies they belong to, and they should belong to the Society of American Foresters, plus others. It's really important to think about their work experiences, and I've alluded to this earlier. If you want to run a sugar bush, if you want to run a silvopasture, if you want to do timber, then you need a forester that has that experience in their toolbox. That said, there are some foresters who've worked with maple production. There's almost no foresters who've worked with silvopasture. There are a few. There's a really good one in Massachusetts, one in Vermont. We have a project in Vermont, a research project, and we've hired a forester to help us on the silvopasture side of that. So that maybe isn't a drop dead, but if it's like normal stuff like having a timber sale or writing a management plan or developing wildlife habitat, those are the kinds of things that every forester should have experience with. Check their references. I have good friends that are practicing foresters, and they say, nobody ever asked me for a list of references. So ask for a list of references. Find out if they have any certification. And at that point, maybe you start thinking about whether or not they had a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree. Again, I'm not sure that I would get, if you feel good from the above points, then the 2-year versus 4-year doesn't really matter. And then finally, if you're hiring them to help you with a sugar bush or with a silvopasture or with timber, say, all right, let's go. Can you take me and introduce me to some of your, or give me the names of some of your previous landowners, and I'd like to go visit those previous jobs. So for the payment, I'm not going to get too deep into the specifics, but I will so there's 2 basic ways that you're going to pay, and you can see those at the bottom. One is a commission and one is a flat rate. So a commission means that you have a timber sale and the forester makes some percentage of that. The standard percentages are usually between 10 and 15%. So if you have a timber sale that's worth $100,000, the logger pays you, or the sawmill pays you $100,000, the forester gets $10,000 or $15,000 out of that. You can also do it on a flat rate, so on a per hour or per acre basis. The commission is more common, particularly with timber sales. I'm a strong advocate of flat rate, just because, and pay a good rate. You know, my mechanic has his flat rate is $65 an hour. My lawyer's $300 an hour. So you're probably going to be between those two for your forester on a per hour basis. And that's the best way to start a fight amongst foresters, is to talk about which is better, commission or flat rate. One advantage of the flat rate is that they can do anything for a flat rate. They can do skid trail layout. They can come up with a tree planting plan. They can do things that don't have a commercial endpoint based on a per hour. If it's a commission, and if the only way they work on a commission, then they're not going to be well suited to do some of these other things that don't generate income. So should you have a contract? Yes, you should have a contract with your forester. And every forester will advise you that you have to have a contract with the logger. And so the logic would hold that you should also have a contract with your forester. The contract's important. It defines the relationship and the details of that. It documents your expectations and the timing of those expectations. And the forester is able to verify what they will or will not be able to provide, and on what timeline and for how much money. So it protects your interests and the interests of the forester. There are some contract terms, and these are probably pretty standard in terms of contracts, but they identify who is who. So who's the landowner, who's in charge, who makes decisions, who does the forester answer to, and similarly, who is the forester, whether or not that forester can sell that contract to somebody else, which I'd suggest you don't allow. How is the forester going to be paid, whether it's commission or flat rate? And I know good foresters that use commission and good foresters that use flat rate. What are the constraints and the expectations? We're going to go into those in the next slide. What are the services that the forester is going to provide, and what's the timeline over which they'll provide those? It's probably a good idea for there to be a glossary so that there are terms that you can look back on. And then finally, make sure you have your attorney review that contract. So the constraints and the expectations, and I'll say that forester contracts are not common. So don't be surprised if your forester looks at you, if you say, well, what's the contract look like? So I can have my attorney review it. They may say something like, I've never had a contract with a landowner. So don't let that shock you or scare you, but it just means you're at a different starting position. And years ago, I developed, I worked with a friend of mine. Our kids were in school together. He was an attorney, and I worked with him to draft a sample contract. And it is absolutely not something that you would use as a boilerplate. It's really just to help you think about the kinds of information that would be included in the contract. So what about new developments? Let's say your forester has been hired and all of a sudden you get a knock on the door from somebody that wants to put up solar panels. How does that change the nature of the relationship that you have with your forester? The forester is going to want to have you verify that they have access and that the people that work for them, and if they have to have contractors, subcontractors that they administer, that they'll have access, and that you can validate the ownership of the property. There may be a discussion about whether there's any post-contract activities. So if you had, certain trees sold, and then you had additional trees sold, is there anything that happens with those? Under what circumstances is the contract terminated, and under what circumstances can changes be made? who carries any liability, if the forester is supervising a road building crew, who's liable in those cases, whether or not the contract can be transferred, and then who has responsibility for subcontractors. And I don't have answers to these questions. I can think about the way I might want to do it as a landowner, but these are the kinds of things that you want to talk to your attorney about and say, where am I at risk? What would be typical under these kinds of situations? Okay, so what should you do now? Again, you want to stay in control, and you do that by becoming informed, which you've been in the process of becoming informed, and know what you want. So if you can identify the end goal and the end game, and you can describe that, then you're going to be well positioned to pick a forester that can help you accomplish that. You should look for and ask for resumes and references, make site visits, and go through interviews and hear proposals. So foresters are not opposed to being interviewed. They shouldn't be opposed to being interviewed, and they should be willing to write up, maybe it's not going to be a 30-page proposal, but it might be a 1 or 2-page proposal. They talk to you, and they can say, okay, here are the things that I can provide, and here's how we would structure our relationship. So it's a process that you go through. What's most important is that you don't just, I would say, don't look in the phone book, don't look in the yellow pages. And if you see, you get those weekly newspapers and somebody has a little advertisement in there and it says forestry services provided, that's, look beyond just the first point of reference that you find. So with that, I will stop, and I'm going to, I think you all have my contact information, so I'm going to stop sharing so I can see the chat window, and I want to give you all a chance to either type in questions or just turn on your microphone and we can start chatting. Okay, so Barb asks a question. Why don't we see more woodlots being managed for coppice products in the U.S.? What do you think of this practice? Great question. So first, let me define coppice for everyone. Coppice is a management style where you cut a tree and you regrow the next forest as sprouts from the stump. It's a more common practice in Europe, and it's relatively uncommon deliberately. It's uncommon as a deliberate practice in the United States, although there are some people that are very excited about it. I'll say that I don't have a lot of experience with it. I've read a little bit about it, so I'm not fully knowledgeable, and I could not give an hour lecture on coppice, but I can give you about a minute on coppice. So my sense is that in England and Great Britain, where it's more common, it's because they had a market that could utilize high quantities of small diameter stems. And so the fastest way to produce high quality small diameter stems is using a vegetative reproductive method such as sprouting from the stump. And when the stump that sprouts is called a stool, and it might produce 3 or 5 or 10 of those sprouts. They would grow very quickly because they're growing from an established root system. And in a matter of years, you could have stems that were a couple inches in diameter. They could cut those and process those. So, and if there's a market for that, that's great. There's nothing fundamentally wrong or bad about coppice. I don't want to give that impression at all. Many of the woodlands that we have in the United States are a version of coppice. It would be probably called something like coppice with standards or coppice with reserve. And that's because in the United States, in the eastern United States, hardwood forests in the late 1800s and early 1900s were cut for what was called chemical wood production, so producing acetone and other kinds of wood chemical products. And when you cut those small stems, even stems sometimes up to 10 or 12 or 20 inches in diameter, will sprout. And so some of these woodlands you walk into, and if you see oak in particular does this, lots of multiple stemmed, 2 or 3 stems from the same point, that was probably a woodland that had been compassed decades ago. And then it was just abandoned from coppice production, so nobody came back in and tended those coppices. So I think it would be, if it's somebody that's interested in something like mushroom bolts and you have oak woodlands, coppice would be a great way to do it. My guess is it was the other advantage of it for Britain, and this is, so now I'm kind of like talking about what I don't know, so which is always dangerous. But if my sense is that livestock had a more ubiquitous, common presence on English countrysides. Maybe this is just artwork that I've seen leads me to believe this. But if that's the case, it would be really difficult to exclude livestock for 10 or 12 years to let seedlings establish and start to grow. But with coppicing, because they're growing from the root system, those sprouts could reach a size where they're safe from impact from livestock within a shorter period of time. So in the US, if you're growing mushroom bolts, you're going to have to find a way to protect them from deer, if not livestock. Coppice might provide you that opportunity. So it looks like Mark might have a question. Oh, okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you again. I've had a great semester. I hope you've enjoyed it and that you felt like this was a good use of your time, and that you learned something and that you benefited from it. And again, I am always available to you. Please don't hesitate to send me an email or call me. I'll monitor the class website for another week or so and make sure that I've responded to all the questions that are there. And if I've missed something or if I've omitted something, please don't hesitate to get a hold of me. And I wish you all great success in your endeavors. And most importantly, please be safe. So it's all of these things. Farming is dangerous. Forestry is dangerous. I hear stories every year about somebody that gets severely injured or killed, and it makes me very sad. And so I'm really hopeful that you're never on that list. So please take your time, be safe, make sure you get home every day. So thank you all very much.